pleasure to be able to talk to you about the book. It brings up a lot of issues, La Trobe's religious beliefs, his life as an adventurer, explorer, the role of democracy, what he thought about democracy, how he dealt with Indigenous peoples, and his personal circumstances, his sort of impecunious state in many instances. But I want to start at the beginning. How did you become interested in La Trobe, and how did you approach the task of researching and writing about him?
Well, as you know, the State Library is associated with the publication of this book, and in many ways it's a State Library book. It would never have been written but for the State Library. I grew up in the La Trobe Valley, and I ended my working life at La Trobe University. So, of course, I had a certain amount of curiosity about La Trobe. Added to that, my great-grandmother's family came from Chaux-de-Fonds, which is the second largest city in the canton of Neuchâtel, which of course is where Sophie La Trobe was born, and she and La Trobe lived there for a number of years. But I probably wouldn't have got beyond idle curiosity if I hadn't become editor of the La Trobe Journal in 1998, I think it was. And naturally, as editor of the journal, I was more and more interested in the man La Trobe. And I discovered what a large collection of La Trobe material was here at the State Library. Now, there is one person to be singled out here, and that's Diane Riley, who was the La Trobe librarian at the time. Some of you will remember the Australian collection used to be housed separately as the La Trobe Library. Diane wrote a thesis which was published as a book. Her devotion to La Trobe was La Trobe, the man, as well as La Trobe Library, the institution. Her devotion to La Trobe was quite legendary, and her enthusiasm, I think, affected us all. Now, during her research, Diane personally copied thousands of pages of material from the chateau in Neuchâtel, and they are now in the library here. That's, in other words, she collected all the relevant La Trobe material in Neuchâtel, which means that the State Library is the place you come to if you're going to do something about La Trobe. And perhaps at this point I could say something which might embarrass you slightly, because it's about you and your colleagues. But while I know there's tremendous enthusiasm now for technology, and the digitization of documents allows us to sit at home and do research, as I had to do for several long periods. But there is nothing like coming to a library and meeting with the librarians who've done all that hard work of collecting, organising, indexing, annotating, and then are prepared to give good advice to researchers. And I owe a great deal to the librarians of the State Library, and if I may say so, Kevin, especially to your area, to the manuscripts librarians. That means, of course, when I think about it, the readers of the book I'm most nervous about, are the librarians. Because they will spot the inadequacies or errors. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to acknowledge publicly what I owe to the State Library.
Oh, thank you, John.
I don't know if you want me to say anything about what I thought I was doing with the book.
We can maybe come back to that.
Okay.
There are a few things I'd like to tease out about La Trobe. One that's always intrigued me is what does it mean when we call La Trobe a Moravian? Did he pray? Did he consult the Bible for direction? Or did he just seek inner guidance? We know he attended services, he took communion, the La Trobe family had a pew at St. Peter's in Eastern Hill. But how did his religious life manifest itself, especially in terms of his political beliefs? Was it really that important?
Well, I think La Trobe's religious beliefs were absolutely central to his whole life and influenced every aspect of his work as a colonial official. You ask what did it mean to be a Moravian. The Moravian Church, as we call it, was an 18th century revival of an earlier pre-Reformation movement in Czechoslovakia. There are several characteristics that I think are relevant. One, it was a comparatively small membership, and there was no attempt to make large numbers of converts. The Moravians thought of themselves as rather special, and with that sense of being a special group came a sense of great responsibility. What they were wanting always to create was what's suggested in their official title, the unity of the brethren. So there's a great emphasis on community, and with that went an emphasis on individual salvation. The Moravians are quite different from some other religious groups which were concerned with social reform, for example. The Moravians kept out of politics completely. This seems a bit extraordinary in a way, as it's generally assumed that they were active anti-slavers. They were so strict that when a member of the Bedford congregation signed a petition against slavery, he was told he had to have his name removed and to apologise for involving the church in politics. So the Moravians tended politically to accept the status quo. They put the emphasis, as I said, on individual salvation, and that meant, I think, trying to find in yourself what was the will of God. La Trobe once wrote, "I have been taught from my childhood to bend my spirit to the will of God." And I think that affected his whole approach to his responsibilities. On the one hand, a very, very strong sense of duty. On the other, a caution. He didn't want to act until he was sure that he could see his way clear. In other words, he was always trying to find out what was the will of God.
And I think some people read that as indecision, because he did take his time to think about what the best direction was, and people just saw him as being slow to suddenly decide.
Vacillating was one of the criticisms.
Yeah.
That's right, Yeah.
La Trobe was an explorer. He loved the outdoors. He loved roughing it, collecting fossils, rocks, plants, seeds. He was a horse rider. He was known, as a fine horseman, despite the fact that he rode his horses very hard. That love of the outdoor life, his discussions with people like John Franklin, the explorer, or Ronald Gunn, the botanist, were very important in in the way that he saw his place in society. He sent plant samples back to Neuchâtel. He sent specimens to Hooker at Kew. He was instrumental in setting up the Melbourne Botanical Gardens. That all points to an alternative life that he could have led, or he was never fully in a position to lead or to take the initiative to lead. Do you think that was always preying on his mind, that there was another life that he didn't lead?
I think so. I think you're right about that. He may well have believed that when he got the position at Port Phillip, that he would be able to combine that with his interests in natural history. He hadn't been trained in any discipline, but he was a very, very keen botanist and also a geologist, for that matter. And in a small way, he was able to go on, but he was unlike his father in this respect. He couldn't satisfactorily combine his personal interests with his responsibilities. His father, Christian Ignatius La Trobe, was a very conscientious clergyman, but he was also a very fine musician who actually did a great deal to alter musical taste in England in the 18th century, introducing German music, for example, to Britain, helping the great Dr. Burney to write his history of music. And he was able to balance the two. But I think La Trobe always regretted that he hadn't been able to do that. There's a letter he wrote once to Gunn after being in Tasmania and being with Gunn, saying that really he enjoyed much more the sort of discussions they'd been having than the politics he had to deal with back in Port Phillip. Perhaps I'd just add to that, one of the areas of interest in which La Trobe as a young man showed very little interest was government. His appointment didn't, as it were, flow naturally from the interests he had pursued as a young man. It's an indication, I think, of his very strong sense of duty, that he stuck at his job even at some personal cost.
But his travelling made him quite well aware of what was happening in the world around him, especially pre-1848 and then post-48 with the revolutions in Europe. The time that he and Albert Portales spent in North America and then in Mexico gave him a chance to understand the role of developing democracy, of democratic institutions and the popular vote. What effect did that have on him? What did he see that he liked? And obviously there are things he saw there that he disliked intensely.
Well, I think even before he went to America, he was quite sure that he was out of sympathy with what he called the spirit of the times. It's a phrase that appears in the Rambler in North America. It appears in his official correspondence, where he makes it quite clear that he's a conservative. He doesn't like the push towards democratic institutions. And what he saw in America didn't encourage him to revise that view. It meant, I think, that he had the feeling that things were going in a direction he didn't like, but he couldn't stop that development.
That, when we come to look at the time he spent in Victoria, I wondered if he seriously misread Australian society. And I'm thinking about the really vicious attacks by Faulkner, Kerr, McCombie, the journalists on the Argus. Were they justified? Also, perhaps John Cotton as well. It seems that they had a vision of Victoria and that La Trobe couldn't quite understand what that vision was.
Well, I'm not sure that the three you mentioned had a particularly clear vision. The politics in Port Phillip in the 1840s are extremely personal and petty.
Quite vicious.
Vicious is the right word. La Trobe gave great offence to some people when they discovered he had told the Colonial Office that he did not think there were people in Port Phillip really ready for self-government. And this was regarded as a great insult. La Trobe was not a politician. If I could give you an example of this, in I think it was 1841, Governor Gipps from Sydney came down to Melbourne. He was La Trobe's superior. La Trobe was the superintendent of the district of Port Phillip, and Gipps was the governor of New South Wales, which included Port Phillip. And at a banquet, La Trobe, wishing to pay a compliment to the governor, said he was happy to play second fiddle to Governor Gipps. Well, this was held against him for the rest of his time in the colony, and he surely knew by that time the feeling in Melbourne against Sydney and the Sydney administration. The feeling was, they're not treating us fairly, much the sort of feeling that we have now about, say, Canberra, or I suppose we still have that sort of feeling a bit about Sydney versus Melbourne. But I do think in handling the local politicians, La Trobe wasn't as tactful as he might have been. One of the objections the town council had to him, and it was part of their case against him, which led to petitions for his recall, he didn't invite the councillors to dinner at Jolimont. They wanted the kind of recognition that he didn't give them.
And there are reasons for that. We might come to that. The fact what La Trobe was paid, whether or not he had money to entertain, they were all crucial issues to he and his family. And I'd like to perhaps first just look at La Trobe and the Aboriginal Protectorate in Victoria, because it's one of the key areas that that was important in his time. He didn't get on with George Robinson, the Chief Protector, and the other assistant protectors, Dredge, Seabright, Parker, and William Thomas. Apart from William Thomas, those others were not really suited for the positions that they held. William Thomas, it seems, was the person who fulfilled what was required for an assistant protector in terms of living with Indigenous groups, travelling with them, writing about them, trying to understand them. La Trobe also, it seems, was unable to deal adequately with the squatters. I'm thinking of Niall Black in the Western District, and certainly Angus Macmillan in Gippsland, where rumours abounded about what was happening to Indigenous people and the randomness of a lot of the killings. At one point, La Trobe referred to the Aboriginal people in Melbourne as just vagrants. From his experiences in America with the Osage Indians, in Jamaica with the slave population, his experiences in frontier societies, how do we judge him? Was he a man of his times, or just somebody who was simply out of touch with liberalising forces in society?
Well, I think La Trobe was acknowledged as a very humane man who was concerned to do what he could for the Aboriginal people. We were talking earlier about his Moravianism, and that coloured his view of the Indigenous people. He accepted, as I think most people did, the dichotomy between civilized and uncivilized, and the Indigenous people were regarded as uncivilized, and people like La Trobe felt they had a responsibility to try to civilize the Indigenous people. But La Trobe had a particular view which not all would have shared. He saw the Indigenous people as savage heathens, and the first responsibility, he thought, was to bring the gospel to them. The Moravians don't stand out now as missionaries the way they did in the early 19th century. They were really the leaders of the great missionary movement in the 18th century. And La Trobe, in his official capacity, did what he could to support the Moravian missionaries who came to Victoria. His belief was that civilization would follow Christianity. If the Aboriginal people could be brought what he thought of as the gift of the gospel, then they would become in time civilized. But bringing Christianity to them was for him the number one personal responsibility he had. Just to digress a little, in the display that will be available after the talk, there's a strut drawing of an young Aboriginal man, Murrumbula, who took the name, the extraordinary name, of Charles Never. And he was a protege of La Trobe's. La Trobe saw this young man at the Merry Creek School, and he personally paid for him to be apprenticed to a Collins Street tailor to learn the art of tailoring, and then La Trobe appointed him tailor to the native police. So that was an indication of his sort of feeling of helping to raise the people up. But you've set up an opposition of man of the time and a man out of touch with liberalising tendencies. I think La Trobe tried to carry out the official policy of the government, but neither he nor the people in the protectorate really had much understanding of Aboriginal customs and especially spirituality, a complete lack of understanding, I think, of the link between the indigenous people and the land. So when he's referring to them as vagrants, they were Aborigines who'd been living in the Melbourne area, who were, as it were, pushed out. And then they turned up, they came back to their own land, but they were demoralised, and generally the settlers saw them as a social problem. There was also, and it is something of an irony, there was also the problem of the corroborees. The Aboriginal population in the Melbourne area was mainly over the river on the side where the Botanic Gardens are now. And I was just looking in the Port Phillip Gazette for 1840 the other day, and there's a notice from La Trobe saying that the punt across the river will not operate after 6 o'clock in the evening, except in very special circumstances. Now that was to stop people going across the river to go to where the Aborigines were camped to watch a corroboree. But I knew you were going to ask me about the Aborigines, and do you think I could just read something of La Trobe's?
So.
Yeah. La Trobe, I think, struggled very hard to protect the Aboriginal people. He was, in all sorts of ways, restricted. There was, as I mentioned, a native police force, but a native policeman could arrest a white man and take him to jail, but he could not give evidence against him in court because he was not a Christian and couldn't take the oath. La Trobe tried to have that altered, but the British government said it couldn't have a rule in the colonies which was different from the rule in Britain. So you have that dreadful anomaly. The reactions of the squatters and, well, the population generally varied. There were people who were sympathetic and showed some understanding, but there were a great many who thought Aboriginal lives didn't matter. And there was one episode which brings out, I think, more than anything else, the strength of La Trobe's feelings as a Christian. He received a petition from a number of squatters in the Western District asking for protection against Aborigines on the ground that they were stealing sheep and cattle and so on. And at the very same time, he received reports of the murder of an Aboriginal woman and her children from one of the stations the squatter of which had signed the petition. And La Trobe and Gibbs were both outraged. And La Trobe replied to the petition in language which sounds to me very much more like that of a preacher than an official. Will not the commission of such crimes call down the wrath of God and do more to check the prosperity of your district and to ruin your prospects than all the difficulties and losses under which you labour? I call upon you as your first duty to yourselves and to your adopted country to come forward in aid of the authorities to clear up the obscurity with which this deed is as yet involved, and purging yourselves and your servants from all knowledge of and participation in such a crime, never to repose until the murderers are declared and your district relieved from the stain of harbouring them within its boundaries. I think that makes his feelings very clear.
Yeah, definitely it does. John, I'd like to ask you a question about La Trobe and money. You remarked that La Trobe was in debt for most of his time in Victoria. How did that impact on his lifestyle, his ability to play host, to lead high society, aspiring society in Melbourne? For example, he never celebrated the Queen's birthday, which seems to me like heresy for this sort of society. How does his position compare with other colonial administrators?
Yes, well, I think he probably was the poorest man ever appointed to such a position. When he was first appointed, his salary was £800 a year. Then a resident judge was appointed, and his salary was £1,500 a year. So La Trobe's salary had to be raised to meet that of the judge. And then after the gold rushes, his salary was greatly increased. It actually went up eventually to 5,000, which enabled him to clear his debts. But it was a real problem that he didn't have a great deal of money to spend on entertainments. And he did make the point, the moment he arrived actually, that he would be living very modestly.
Was he allowed to invest?
Pardon?
Was he allowed to invest in land as a superintendent and then as a governor? Was he allowed to use his disposable income in the ways that other people in Victoria were using theirs?
Well, he did actually invest, but he was attacked by the resident judge, Judge Willis, for speculation, which was not the case at all. La Trobe defended himself very vigorously, and thereafter was very careful about his investments. He did have one windfall, and that was when he arrived at Melbourne, there was no official residence for him. He had to provide his own accommodation. And with the permission of Governor Gibbs, he erected a cottage on the government paddock, which was a 12.5 acre paddock, Jolimont. It was agreed that the land should be put up for auction, and a minimum price was set, and at the auction no one bid against La Trobe. So he got the land at what was a bargain price, and as it turned out, that really was virtually the whole of his assets. He did have some cash that he was able to invest. I think he had money that he would have spent on the land if the price had been higher. But essentially Jolimont, which was later subdivided, made up for the fact he had no superannuation, and he got a very miserable pension from the British government. That's a separate issue. There's a fascinating book which I'm sure many people here will know, Port Phillip Gentleman by Paul de Serval, who talks about the attitudes, the social attitudes, the sense of hierarchy. And it's clear that in the view of a number of the colonists, La Trobe didn't perform well. He wasn't a leader of society in that sense. Ironically, in 1853, actually after his wife and children had gone back, he did give a ball, and it cost £800, exactly the amount of his original annual salary. I must say the concern with social proprieties does cause you to raise your eyebrows at times. One newspaper accused La Trobe of public indecency. Now, you might think that's pretty serious business. What had he done? Had he appeared in the street in his nightshirt or worse? No. Lady Mary Fitzroy, the wife of the governor in Sydney, had been killed in a carriage accident. And La Trobe was accused of public indecency because he hadn't gone into public mourning. I mean, it really is extraordinary. And that also reflects on the level of political conflict, you know, that something like that should be brought up.
Please join me in thanking John Barnes and Kevin Molloy. Thank you.